The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome out to our very first Jitterbit Tech Talk. All right, so today, let's just talk a little bit about the Tech Talk. We're going to be talking and discussing today's topic, which is going to be air handling for about 30 minutes. Okay, so the Tech Talks they will vary based upon uh, that specific day, but nevertheless, today we're going to be talking some about error handling. Okay, so let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jared Stone. I am the Jitterbit University Administrator, and I also have special guest Corey Willis, who is the Director of Customer Enablement. How are you doing, Corey?
Doing well, Jared. Glad to be on with you today.
Great, great. We're very excited to have you. Like I mentioned just a moment ago, today we're going to be talking about a very hot topic, okay? Error handling. That's something that all of us are very intrigued by because it uh, affects our integration so much. So we're going to be talking some about the best practices, and I know through our conversations that we've had earlier that you have a top five for air handling best practices. So let's go ahead and jump right on into that.
Well, sure thing, Jared. So before we get into the top five itself, I want to talk about kind of three different buckets, so to speak, that we categorize the various error handling within Jitterbit into. The first one of these is operation errors, and this is what most people are familiar with within Jitterbit. It's when an operation itself returns a failure status. Of course, you can have successes, which is what we always hope for, right? But you can also have failures. Now, these failures, they could be due to various things like transformations. You've got some invalid data going into a transformation. It causes it to fail. Invalid data structures, things like that. You've got endpoint issues, typically around authentication. Hey, we're trying to access this source, pull some data in, do some stuff with it, put it to one of these targets, and either the source or the target can't authenticate, can't connect, it times out, something along those lines. You could also occasionally come across some system-induced operation errors. This is typically seen when you're running things like a local agent, and maybe, for instance, your local agent machine runs out of disk space. Things like that. Those all can cause operation errors. The great thing in Jitterbit, though, is that these operation errors, and we'll talk about this in one of the five best practices that we're going to cover today, these types of errors, they can be handled typically fairly easy with an error notification. From there, we move into the endpoint returned errors, and these get a little trickier. Endpoint returned errors, this would be more along the lines of, hey, we're connecting to a system like NetSuite or SAP or Salesforce or some other SOAP service out there, sometimes even a REST service. And that system that we connect to, it sends us a response back, and Jitterbit looks at it and goes, hey, we got a response. Awesome, it's a successful operation. But in that response, it includes that, hey, this data wasn't processed due to this error from the endpoint. Those are a little trickier to handle than just a typical operation error because the operation is deemed successful. We made a call, we got a response, everything worked the way that Jitterbit expected, but your system is returning an error. Those need to be handled as well. You can also have custom validation errors, and oh my gosh, here the floodgates just open wide. You can do all sorts of things when you start leveraging Jitterbit script or even JavaScript within the studio and design your own custom logic. But from there, we can move on into what our top five error handling best practices that we selected for this particular tech talk would be. Now, those here again, when we talk about things like error handling, oh my gosh, this topic is so expansive, and a lot of the situations out there, unfortunately, the answer is going to be, well, it depends. Because it depends on the system you're connecting to. It depends on how you're connecting. It depends on what type of operation you're doing. But today, what I've tried my best to do is to narrow this down to five high-level best practices. Some of these are a little bit more philosophical, if I can use that word, in nature. Some of them are more technical and practical, but I think it does put us on the right track moving towards best practices. So let's go ahead and dive into the first one here. And the first one, very philosophical, but it is value quality error handling. Now, of course, we're all here at an error handling tech talk. You see value in it. Okay, but as an organization, you need to see value in spending the time and resources that it takes to develop quality error handling within your integrations. The first thing is, as an organization, adopt your best practices. We can give you recommended best practices, but it's up to you in your organization to sit down with your team and say, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to name things. This is how we're going to send emails. This is, you sit down and adopt what you want to adopt as your organizational best practices. Now, I know that that seems counterintuitive in a way. You're here trying to learn from us. We're going to give you some recommendations. It's up to you to adopt them. The next thing is allow enough time to implement best practices. It's real easy to go in and scope out a project and say, okay, I know that this is going to take, let's say it's a large project. This is going to take 3 weeks of time to do this project. Did you account for error handling? You see, I actually went out to our professional services team internally, and I said, how much time do you guys take when you're implementing a project to devote to error handling? And the responses came back anywhere from 10 to 25%. So the recommendation I'm going to give you today is expect to allow upwards of 25% of your project design time specifically devoted to implementing error handling. If you go in without that expectation, then it's going to sidetrack you. It's going to catch you off guard. You're going to just simply expect that you're going to have time to do it. Make sure you allot for it. If you're allotting 3 weeks for your project, allot a 4th week just to go in and make sure that you have appropriate error handling. Now, if we do these things, if we find value in error handling and we value quality error handling as an organization, it's going to end up really reaping the benefits. You're going to end up reaping the benefits with faster and more efficient troubleshooting if and when a problem begins to arise.
Wow, that's some great information, Corey, and that definitely will add a ton of value to the organizational operations. Having the mindset to allow 25% for project design time and whatnot around error handling is some great information. So that is the first of the top 5 error handling best practices. Let's move on to number 2, which is going to be notifying appropriately. Take it away, Corey.
Okay, so yeah, notify appropriately. You guys, I know if you've been in the studio, you've seen, I'm sure you've seen where you can go in on an operation and say, on failure, send an email message. If you haven't, I'd recommend go check out Jitterbit Foundations and Jitterbit Core in Jitterbit University. We cover that in there, but this is critical. On every single operation, at minimum, I recommend an error notification via email. Okay, but let's get more specific because a lot of us know that, but what do we do with the email? And I'll show you some of this. We're going to get into some examples here very quickly, but leverage dynamic messages. Don't just put a static message and say, hey, this has caused a problem. This operation had an error. Go look at it. Well, that causes more time. You have to go look at the logs. You have to go log into the management console. You've got to extract the data. You have the ability in your message to include the data that you need. Also, engage appropriate audiences. It's real simple, and I've seen this time and time again where people set up a generic notification to blast out to the entire team. It just ends up stealing your organization's time by having to figure out who is dealing with it. Send it to the appropriate audience. Okay, I know it's simple. It's just a very simple little best practice we can implement, though. Let's make sure we engage the appropriate audiences. The next one, include critical information. And I started talking about this with the dynamic messages, but include what project is this in? A lot of us, we have multiple projects out there. And let's be honest, sometimes our naming conventions aren't the best. Okay, this goes back to adopting best practices, and we're going to have more tech talks about best practices, and we'll get into naming at some point, but let's just be honest, sometimes it just doesn't happen, right? And so in those cases, you've got different projects that are named similarly, you've got operations within there that are named similarly. Make sure that in your error messages that you're sending out, these notifications, you include what project is this affecting, so I know where to go look if I need to make a resolution issue. Include what operation failed. Okay, it's real simple. You've got a variable, jitterbit.operation.name. Use it. It is very much a benefit to you. Also, include the full error message. You've got the variables for that. It's things like jitterbit.operation.error, jitterbit.operation.previous error, or last error. There's different ones for different implementations. Check out Success Central to find out all the differences, but use those and engage with your message by including that error. Also, and this is one of those that's probably going to develop more over time, but include potential resolution steps. If you know what could potentially fix this, that, hey, this is an error we get every 2 months. We always forget what's going on. We have to spend the time, spend the cycles, going out there, discovering. Hey, simplify that. Put that right in the email. You get the email, you know what the resolution steps are. Last point I'll mention here, and we can move on, is connect with external systems. And I guess what I'd really say here is don't be afraid to connect with external systems. A lot of us are moving more towards systems like Slack, for instance, for real-time messaging. Hey, we can integrate with Slack, okay? So let's use that. If that's what you're using, and let me kind of preface that. If that's what you're using for your communication, use it. If you're using another system for error logging, use it. I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. But use the systems that you're already using. Don't try to go recreate the wheel. Just use what you're already using. Jitterbit's a wonderful platform connecting to all these different systems, so use it.
Yeah, that's really, once again, great information there, Corey. But let's go ahead and move on to that third best practice.
Okay, so the third one here, we're moving back a little bit to the philosophical side of Jitterbit, but anticipate potential endpoint issues. It's real easy for us to go into a project with the mindset that that system's always going to be online, that things are just always going to work. But let's be honest, people go in, they update passwords, authentication tokens expire, passwords expire, whatever it may be. Systems might go offline. Prepare for it, anticipate it. Try to think through philosophically as you're going through your processes and say, hey, if this system goes down, what impact is it going to have? And try to anticipate some of that. Design your project with ways that you can go through and quickly correct those. And not only quickly correct them, and I'll tell you one of the great things about passwords. Now, if you're using like one of our connectors, we've got one centralized location. It's awesome. But if you're using something else, use project variables. And that's going to help you with some of this here. Moving on into data errors around endpoints. We talked about this already some, that you can get responses back from your systems that include an error message from that system. Handle those. If you open up a response data structure, a response schema, and you see error, don't skip over it. Research it. Figure out, how can I anticipate errors? Hey, if we're in a sandbox scenario, let's cause an error and see what it's going to give us back so we know how to handle that. You could also have scenarios, and this comes in more with REST web services, but you get an unexpected response. We do this a lot with an archive function where we'll make the call, and then we can actually go and parse that, create multiple operations to say, hey, if we get this error structure back, we can handle it this way. If we get the anticipated structure back, we handle it this other way. You know, all that is considerations to take into account here. And so ultimately, just try your best to anticipate those potential endpoint issues that could happen if the system goes down or if the system returns an error to you.
Yeah, you know, it'd be great to think that, you know, these sort of issues and maybe complications in our integrations won't come up necessarily, but I think we'd all be a little naive to think like that. So really anticipating some of those endpoint issues is really key to, you know, our successes and your successes with our integrations for our organization. So let's go ahead and move on to our fourth best practice around error handling, which is considering the entire workflow.
Absolutely. So, you know, a lot of times in Jitterbit, we're not just moving data from point A to point B and that's that. It's not that simple. We want business process. We want to do these more complex workflows. But, you know, the way Jitterbit looks at this is that each individual operation is an individual operation. And so you've got to think through and determine how a failed operation could potentially affect other records. Okay, so say you've got a 5-step process. What happens if step 4 blows up? You know, some of the questions that we can look at here and begin to implement some best practices. Can the data be reprocessed from a persisted data store? It's very attractive to use things like temp storage to move, say, from step 3 to 4. within a process. But if we're using temp storage, that's only for that runtime. If that process blows up, we can't go back and grab that temporary file. So it might be worth exploring, and I'm not saying that this works for everybody, okay? But it might be worth exploring. Should we use something more like a network file share if we're on premise, or if we're using cloud agents, maybe we should use an SFTP server for this to drop those temporary files. You might induce a little bit of latency in the process. It's probably going to be minimal though, and it gives you that ability that then you can retain or persist that file sitting out there. So you could go back and say, well, let me correct that login issue, or whatever that situation was. Maybe it was even a data issue. Well, now I've got the file. I can correct the data issue, and then I can go through and reprocess, picking up just from, say, step 4 in our hypothetical scenario, and move on from there. By doing this, we can avoid things like missed records, duplicate records, orphaned records out there. Another consideration here is, are these processes, are they transactional in nature? Because that has a certain way of playing into things. If you're using more real-time workflows and something fails, your error handling approach is probably going to be a little bit different. You don't want to just wait on somebody 24 hours later to check a file. You're going to want to do something a little more logical in those scenarios. But if it's scheduled, you also have to take into consideration your run times. If you're saying, hey, let's grab all the records that have been changed in the last 24 hours, and one fails and you process it again 24 hours later, are you missing records? So those are all just considerations. Again, a little bit on the philosophical side. The next one's going to be more practical here, but that's what I would say here. Consider that entire workflow as you're implementing your error handling.
Yeah, no, that's some great information there. Once again, adding value to your integrations there, definitely. So let's go ahead and move on into the fifth and final best practice for error handling.
Okay, so this is where we're actually going to start to switch over. We're going to get into the Jitterbit Studio and show you some of this because I've got a couple examples. I feel like this particular topic, it's best to show it rather than explain it, but create custom error handling scripts. So I know I just scared some of you because we're talking about scripts, and we always say that Jitterbit can be used by the business user. It's not that hard. It really isn't. I promise you that. But leverage it. It's a wonderful tool available to you. You can do things around all 3 of those buckets, whether it's operational errors, endpoint errors, or data validation errors. But we've got a whole library of functions and variables available to you. I mentioned some of them already, but for instance, jitterbit.operation.previous.error, that's one out there. You've got the run operation function where you can create your own custom little workflows in there. Eval, we'll show you that one. That one's way better to show than try to explain. Things like write to operation log. But let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and jump over and jump into the Jitterbit Studio. So this is coming up. I've got 2 little operation chains here. I hope I have time to show both of them to you. These are principles that we've extracted out of projects that we use internally. So I'm showing you how we do error handling here at Jitterbit, okay? So this particular operation, this was actually something that was derived out of some of our integrations around our Jitterbit University, okay? Jitterbit University, we use a REST web service to connect into that. It does, it has a separate authentication chain that we have to go through. And here in this get users, okay, this is mocked up just to pull user data out of that system. Really doesn't matter what it does. What I want to focus on is the error handling side of it. We're in an error handling tech talk, right? So over here to the right, notice we have the process failure email. All 3 operations. We have the get users operation, the authentication error handler, and the authenticate operation. If any one of these fail, it's going to send a process failure email. That's step 1. Set that up on everything. But here, I've also created an error operation. So if get users fails authentication, frankly, if it fails for any reason, it's going to run this error handler. Let me show you the script that we built in here. And what we're doing here is we know that this particular web service, if we connect to it and we are not authenticated with a proper authentication token, it's going to give us back a 401 unauthorized. Now, you could do this several different ways. The way we chose to do it is to simply grab the message. Here we're using the variable jitterbit.operation.previous.error, grabbing the error message from the previous operation. We're parsing that because we know what to expect, and we're looking for 401 in the place we would expect it. If we get the 401 error, we go and re-authenticate, and you see this right here using a run operation. Okay, and then we go back, and once we've re-authenticated, we use this here, this run operation, passing in a custom GUID, just a little different way of doing this, but going back and rerunning the get users operation. So we're logically handling it, but remember that email's still there. If we wanted to take this to the next level, right now this if statement doesn't have a false side of it, we could add one, and we could just come in here and say, now right here from the script, send email message and send that process failure. We've added that. Now I can save, go back, and I can take the process failure email completely off of this number one get users right here. Now I've set up the email to only trigger based upon authenticate and authentication error handling if they fail, because I'm logically handling the error in number one get users. So that's that first example that I wanted to show you. Jared, do you think we have time to hit the other one real quick? I know we're pushing it a little.
Yeah, sure. Let's do one more example because we definitely want to get to some questions here at the end, but go ahead and take us away.
Okay. So this one here, this was a little bit different, and this is where I wanted to show you the eval function, because eval can be wonderful. A lot of us are using things like database lookups, Salesforce lookups, database executes, various functions like that that are calling into an endpoint, read file, write file, things like that. When you use those, they can cause problems. Now, I actually kind of doubled up on this sample. This number one sample operation, all this does is cause an error. Right here, raise error script, it's literally all I'm doing is using the raise error function. Some people like to use this in their data validation to say, hey, if the data doesn't pass validation, we don't just want to notify, we want the operation to enter a failure state. If you find yourself in that, this function's perfect for that. But moving on down here into the database error logging. Okay, this is a sample of really two things we're going to show. First, using an external system for logging purposes, for error handling. Okay, so here I just created a little SQL statement to insert things like the timestamp, environment, project name, operation name, and error message into a database. Maybe that's what I use internally in my organization. Maybe I want to do that. So here's an example of how to do it. I just piece together that SQL statement and I run the DB execute. Now in this case, if we step back very quickly though, not that one, here we go. And let's say sample operation fails for whatever reason. And let's say we're just having a really bad day. And then we go to do our database error logging and our day gets even worse. And our database for error handling is offline as well. Okay, it can happen, right? Anything can happen. So in this case, if we run this DB execute and that database is offline, that operation is going to fail. Now, I do have an email here for a process failure, but that's not going to include my original information. But what I could do is I could simply come in here, wrap this in eval. Eval allows me to basically attempt this. It's kind of like a try-catch, okay? So it allows me to attempt it. If it works great on this first argument, the DB execute, everything goes through nicely. Otherwise, I can put in a default, and maybe here I want to once again do a send email message, but now maybe I do error email, which could then include, and I'll show you here on this left side, error email. I allow it to include things like the project name, the previous error, but I could also bring in these variables that I included up here, and that's actually where I'm pulling this all in. And so I could actually get the error from that previous one and bring that in. Okay, my database I couldn't hit, but I'm going to at least send it all as an email. There's so many different things you could do when it gets into this custom error handling side of things. And again here, because now I've got a database error logging, I could remove that process failure from this first one altogether. So I think I've taken up enough time here. We've only got a few minutes left. Jared, I'm going to pass it back to you because I know we've got a few other little things we want to put out as far as resources, and I don't know if we have enough time here for Q&A or not, but I'll let you handle that part.
Yeah, so let's go ahead really quickly, and if we are able to take some questions here in the next few moments, go ahead and put your questions into the chat feature of GoToWebinar. But while you're doing that, I want to talk some about the resources that are available to you all, okay? So the first thing is Success Central. So you can access that by going to success.jitterbit.com. That is a great resource to have. Anytime you have a question or concern in regards to your integration or Jitterbit, all things Jitterbit, definitely feel free to go over to successcentral.com and check out our essentially knowledge library over there. Okay. The second thing that we have for you all is Jitterbit University. Great information out there as well. We have some courses that are available. We are going to be expanding that as time goes on. So right now we have a couple of courses, a couple of certifications. If you would like to take advantage of those opportunities, definitely do so. Like Corey was mentioning today, the topic being error handling, there is a specific error handler module or error handling module within Jitterbit Core. So check that out when you do have some time. And then the final resource is the Jitterbit community. So a great place to converse with other Jitterbitters out there who are solving their integration issues and whatnot. So it's a great resource for you all to have. And as always, if you have questions, definitely feel free to contact your customer success manager, and stay tuned for more tech talks that will be coming up on a regular basis. Okay, so that is what we had for today. And it looks like we have ran short on our time. So the questions that did come through, what we're definitely going to do is follow up with you all. And one more thing to make mention of is that after today's Tech Talk, there's going to be a short survey available. We'd love to get your feedback, hear from you on that. And we'll look forward to talking to you again in the future. And Corey, thanks again for coming out today and chatting with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Jared. And also want to mention I did see a few things come across. The webinar is being recorded. We have recorded this today. We will be posting that out. It's going to make its way out onto Success Central. But we'll be sharing the link with you in the follow-up email, so you will have that available. But thank you guys so much for coming out today. I hope that you have found value in this. Please give us some feedback. We're going to have that in the survey, and just let us know what you would like to hear more of, because we want to keep these Tech Talks going. We want to give you guys a way that you can come in and just continue to learn more about how to implement Jitterbit better for your organization, so you can find more value in it.
All right. Well, you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you next time.